My name is Elizabeth Castelli. I'm the interim director of the Bamard Center for Research on Women, and I'm really glad to be having this event tonight. So I'm really glad you're all here. I want to thank a few entities and individuals. This is an event that is co-sponsored by not only Bamard Center for Research on Women, but also the Office of Student Life here at Bamard, the Athena Center for Leadership Studies, and the Department of Political Science. And so I want to thank everybody for being co-sponsors of this event. I also want to thank the staff at BCRW, Tammy Navarro, Pam Phillips, Hope Dector, Avi Cummings, Che Gossett, I got them all, and our two research assistants, Emily and Emily, who are over here, holding down the fort at the table, and also just all the other people who work here at Bamard who make events like this possible, whose work is often invisible to us, the facilities staff, the AV folks, public safety, the other people who, events management, who all do the logistical sorts of things that bring us to this space. So think of their labor too, as you're grateful for being here. Okay, so we have two wonderful guests here. The filmmaker, Anne de Mare, who is an amazing documentarian. I met Anne this summer at the Provincetown Film Festival when I went to see her film, and by the end of the film I was, like, can you be my best friend? Because I love this film, it's amazing, and I'm so happy that we were able to bring it to Bamard. And she's going to do a little introduction to the film. What we're going to do is she's going to do an intro to the film. We'll watch the film, and then she and my amazing, wonderful colleague, Flora Davidson, longtime member of the Political Science Department, former associate provost, all-around mensch, can I say that? Dear friend and colleague is going to be in conversation with Anne, and then we'll open it up for a little bit of discussion. The film runs about an hour and 15 minutes, just as you're thinking about all the things you have to do. You can, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Anne to say a little bit about the film itself, and then we'll dim the lights and see the film.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you to Bamard for having us, and thank you to all of you for coming here on a Tuesday night to watch a movie about politics. It's really hard, I think, right now to engage in these issues. I think we're all really overwhelmed in the world right now. So I just want to appreciate the fact that we're sitting here to talk about voting and to talk about being a citizen. And I want to put the film in a tiny bit of context, which is that we didn't really set out to make a film about voting rights. We set out to make a film about what it felt like to be a citizen around the 2016 presidential election. One of the things that myself and the other producers on the film were really frustrated with was this sort of top-down way that everyone was talking about politics, that there was a conversation about the executive office and not really a conversation about anything else. And I really wanted to explore what it felt like to be a citizen of conscience, to be out in the world doing things as a citizen. And I was really fortunate to have these remarkable people who were going to go down and volunteer to do voter protection work at the polls. And so we went down to find them. So there's so much to talk about when you talk about democracy right now and what's in danger and what we need to be thinking about. There's certainly, voting has been very much in the news with Georgia and what's going on there in North Dakota, particularly. And we just got back from screening in Wisconsin over the weekend and had some really interesting conversations there. But this is one very specific story. So you can sit back and relax. It's not really a didactic film. It's not going to talk at you a lot. It's really the experience of these people. So I ask you to just kind of slow your mind down and try to enter their story a little bit. And I hope you enjoy it, and we'll be back up with Flora afterwards to talk more. So thank you so much.
This is the third time I've seen this film, and it still hits me in the gut. It is so powerful. Before we open it up to questions, I'd like to make a few remarks. Give me a second to pull them out. I recently was traveling abroad, and our last stop was in Amsterdam. And at the Amsterdam airport, returning to New York, and this was just a few days ago, I was selected for extra security screening. Those random screenings, and I was pulled aside by a very lovely Dutch woman who was working the security team, and she did what she had to do, and it was a lot of patting me down to check chemicals and all that. And when she finished, she was very lovely, and she said, now, you're done, and everything's fine. Now, get on the plane, go home, and please vote. We are very worried about you people. That blew me away. As is noted in this film, and I think it did a very effective job of not just showing the emotion, but also communicating the facts. Many Republican-controlled states began to enact new laws that amount to what we now recognize as a new form of voter suppression. Especially, it began really in earnest after the 2000 election, but as we know, has speeded up dramatically since the Shelby County versus Holder decision in June of 2013, which struck down the key provision of the Voting Rights Act. And I think that this film shows very clearly the impact of dismantling the 1965 Voting Rights Act on the 2016 election. What we saw on the ground was the human dimension, something that I think we never really get to see through the media or through our reading or through the press. We saw 4 volunteers, 4 human beings, Laverne, Stephen, Claire, and Trista, and their allies on the ground in North Carolina, just doing the gritty day-to-day work of trying to protect voters. We know that since 2016, attempts to prevent specific groups of voters from casting their ballots have only intensified. If you thought this was bad, hold your horses. It's going to get worse. As increasingly sophisticated and targeted tactics are being implemented by powerful state officials and increasingly being allowed to stand by the court system, and we expect the Supreme Court, as it already did in the North Dakota decision that will hopefully not disenfranchise, but it may, many Native American voters. We are reaching the point where there is genuine concern that elections may be stolen outright in next week's midterm elections, and the legitimacy of our electoral system will be undermined and compromised. But what we are witnessing today is not new. As Michael Waldman notes in the introduction to his recent book called The Fight to Vote, the fight to vote has always been at the heart of our national story, and raucous debates over how to expand democracy have always been at the center of American politics. Our efforts to translate ideals into the reality of representative government has been about more than process. For more than 2 centuries, it's been raw, rowdy, a fierce and often rollicking struggle for power. At every step of the way, while some fought to gain a voice in their government, others fought just as hard to silence them. Voting rules have always entangled with broader issues of wealth, class, race, campaign finance, and political parties. We know, for instance, that it has taken numerous constitutional amendments to explicitly enshrine the right to vote, which was not there in the original Constitution. And I can quickly run through the 15th Amendment, which extended the vote to black men after the Civil War, the 17th Amendment in 1913, which required popular election of senators, the 19th Amendment in 1920, which gave women the right to vote, the 23rd Amendment in 1961, which gave the right to vote for president to the residents of the District of Columbia, who until then were not allowed to vote for president. The 24th Amendment in 1964, which finally prohibited poll taxes in federal elections. And of course, my favorite, the 26th Amendment in 1971, which lowered the voting age to 18 from 21. I couldn't vote until I was 21. but I could drink at 18 in New York. And then they reversed it. Um, as we all know now, many of these amendments were stymied by racial terrorism, but also by structural reforms that were well-intentioned, like voter registration requirements, at-large elections, nonpartisan elections. And these structural reforms were not just in the South, they were all over the United States. These and other local measures all serve to disproportionately either dilute, depress, or repress the votes of African Americans, immigrants, and the urban working class. So as we show concern now about states that have cut back on early voting or eliminated same-day registration or reduced the number of polling places, all of which took place in North Carolina, or passing voter ID and proof of citizenship laws, all of which make voting harder, we should first look to our own state of New York, where none of these things exist. There was an editorial in the New York Times a little over a month ago. Let me find the quote, hold on. This is from September 13th, the New York Times editorial. New York's electoral laws and practices are mired in the dark ages, prevented from entering the 21st century by lawmakers trying to protect their own jobs. The voting turnout in New York in 2016 in the presidential election was lower than 40 other states at 57%. In the 2014 midterms, New York ranked 48th in the United States at 34%. Why? Well, some of the reason may be that we've never had early voting in New York, we have never had same-day registration, and that absentee ballots are very difficult to obtain. You have to prove that you're going to be out of the country or that you are the caretaker of someone who needs help. Most states, or at least 27 of them, have no excuse absentee ballots. I'm not even going to talk about the states that mail out ballots to everyone, where we have, I think it's Oregon and Washington, is it?
I think so.
Where everything is done by mail?
Yeah, everything's done by mail.
So, as we criticize other states, let us not forget what has been going on in New York State before we start throwing stones at others. With that as context, I'd like to turn to Anne and ask her a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Anne, in an interview that you gave in April of 2018, you said, "Everything about our political reality begins at the polls. I want people to understand how much modern voter suppression is out there and that it looks really different than voter suppression in the past." Can you elaborate on that statement?
Yeah, sure. I think that one of the things that I learned, I think probably the biggest thing I learned in making the film was that whereas in my head from my education were all these images from the civil rights movement of people being forcibly prevented from voting, very obvious efforts being made to deter people from voting. What it looks like now is really insidious, really systematic. It's a million little cuts, right? So it's a combination of laws that make it more difficult for people to register, to shifting polling places, to bad communication about the changes in laws, so that you create barrier after barrier after barrier, and that they really add up to something that's much more extreme than I was expecting. I think what's so interesting is in the film, at the end of the night, there's sort of always an audible gasp in the audience when you see that statistic, that 1,200 people showing up and 598 people being able to vote. But we've seen all day these tiny, small confusions and misdirections and registration problems that individually don't seem like a lot, but they add up to something that's truly extraordinary. And the other thing I want to say about that statistic that's really terrifying is that The reason why we know that number is that the person who was working inside on that poll was really good, and she had a clicker, and she clicked every single person who walked in to vote, and then she was able to push that up against the number of ballots cast. That number is not something we're tracking as a country. We don't know how many people try to vote and are not allowed to vote. We have no concept of that. And so it's really a challenging situation, especially when there's irregularities with how people are dealing with provisional ballots and on all the rest. So just to keep in mind, so that's what I meant by that, is that it looks really different. And it's harder to put your finger on, so it's harder to understand how do you fight it. And I just want people to understand that it's there and what it looks like.
Thank you. This was a very personal story. Yeah. And I think the person who I paid most attention to was Laverne. Yeah. And I noticed the first time I saw the film that she was not only one of the primary volunteers, but that she was also a producer and provided legal assistance. Yeah. Can you tell us a little more about Laverne?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely adore Laverne Berry. I think she's an extraordinary individual, and she did not want us to make this movie about her. The way the film sort of came about was that the other producer was working with Laverne as her lawyer on a project, and Laverne said, we have to really wind this up because come November, I disappear for a while, and I go down and I do voter protection work. And Elizabeth, the other producer, went, oh, and she called me up on the phone and she's like, I really think that we should go and follow Laverne, do this work as a way to talk about what's going on in the country and what it feels like to be a person right now. And so we went and we asked Laverne and she said no, and she continued to say no for a very long time. But, I mean, I think one of Laverne's biggest concerns was that the presence of a camera crew would be intimidating to voters, and for her the number one thing was the work on the ground. And so I signed releases, I signed paperwork with Laverne that I would never sign with anyone else, that basically said she could tell me to turn the cameras off at any time, that she was really in charge of how that process went. And she came on board as a producer of the film, partly because she was so invested in that and wanted to be that tight with the production. So that's where that came from. And I have to say I've been very grateful for her in the process. She didn't ask me to change anything in the film, which was extraordinary to me because she had the right to do that. But also just because she was so informed and so active in the work, she was a tremendous person to have on the producing team because of that. And we really worked very closely, all of us, on getting the story across and making it as powerful as we could. So.
Thank you. Yeah. One of the most poignant scenes in the film, and it wasn't only poignant, it made us all relive that night, was the end of Election Day when they were all back at the hotel. And Steve had his meltdown. And we all had meltdowns that night. Yeah. Can you tell us more about what happened in that room and what we didn't see?
Well, they almost didn't let me film that one. In fact, when they first went up to the room, they wouldn't let the cameras up. I went up with them, and there were a lot of tears, and we were sort of watching the results come in the very beginning. Eventually, about 15 minutes later, they let me bring Nelson up, my camera person, and Nelson and I filmed the rest of the night. But I thought I missed it because I thought I missed their initial reaction. But it wasn't until really we looked at the footage afterwards and we saw it that we realized there was a real scene there. I will say that scene was the most controversial scene in the process of editing the film. A lot of people wanted us to cut that scene. Because they felt as if it made the film into a partisan argument. They thought it presented too much partisanship into a film that was about voting rights. And what's interesting is that now that we've come the distance from the election that we've come and we're sort of in the place we are, the scene is much less shocking than it was right after the election. And I had the best response I had. I've been traveling around the country with it to a lot of schools and universities, and there was a young man at the University of Kentucky who said something about that scene that I really loved, which was that he thought the scene was so important because we all live in our public discourse at that heightened place of sort of like of where Steve was that night. If you go on social media, if you listen to the news, we're all living in this extreme place of really passionate reaction to whatever's going on, and that to watch someone go through that and dial it back and laugh about it and start again and take action is like a modeling that we really need right now. And I thought that was a really beautiful point, so I share that with you, because I think that scene is really important for all of us to kind of go through and come out the other end of.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
So we did learn some really depressing statistics, that less than 1/3 of those provisional ballots were counted, that less than 1/2 of the voters who went to the Cliffdale Recreation Center were able to cast a ballot. If the election results in the upcoming midterms do not meet public expectations for legitimacy, how do social activists and volunteers find the motivation and the inner resources to continue the struggle?
Whoa. I wish that I personally had the answer to that. I don't. I think that the journey for me through reliving that night every night for a couple of years, and for the work that we've done in the world with the film, is that voting is so important on a personal level to people, and it's that personal value that we have to understand and cherish and encourage and help each other with. And if we can do that, even if the election feels, even if the results and the battles we fight are really huge, we will have the resources to fight it. This isn't just about who wins and who loses an election. This is about the fundamental idea of, are we actually governing ourselves? And are we insisting that we have the right to govern ourselves? And I think that that's what sits at the base of it, and sort of reinvigorating that idea, not about who wins and who loses, but really about how we take care of our own right to vote. And that means us voting, it means us helping our fellow citizens vote. I mean, we elect people in church basements and firehouses and school auditoriums all around the country. And every single person in this room can go and be a part of that process on the other side of it. You know, we can all volunteer to work those polls. We can all volunteer to be poll observers. We can all do that work. And I think that that's the lesson for me, is to not despair and think that someone else is preventing it, but for us to step up and actually participate in the process.
Well, you may have answered my next question, which is, I assume that many people in this room already contribute money and go to rallies and marches.
Thank you.
What would you advise people to do if they want to get even more engaged?
Yeah.
And what do you think are some of the most effective forms of action?
Yeah. I think that the most effective things, I mean, and I'm not an expert on this, there are so many organizations that do tremendous work. Align yourself with one of them. And some of them are really been around for a long time. The League of Women Voters rocks. I mean, they really rock. We've had members from their organization at almost all of the screenings that we've done for the Q&As, and inevitably they have the best sense of humor. They're the most informed, and they're involved in ways that even I don't understand, you know, that I'm not aware of. And the other thing that I will say when we're in this, you know, pit of despair that is kind of modern politics, is activism is actually really fun. And that's the piece I think people forget. They think it's like this big pain in the neck to make a difference. Like, I think that's the lesson of Steve and Claire and Trista and Laverne, is that you can, you know, hook up with a couple of friends and go and do something, and it's actually rewarding in a lot of different ways. So that's my kind of plug for getting involved. But there are also, on those handouts you got, there's lots of information, websites you can join, suggestions for things you can do, so.
And do we have a handout? Do we
Yeah,
have-
there are handouts, they're on the table.
Good.
See, thank you, Emily.
All right, I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor now. What I'm going to do is ask for 2 or 3 questions at a time so that we can answer them all. Well, we hopefully will be able to do more questions that way.
I was a little puzzled because I came a couple of weeks ago to the lecture that Michael Miller gave, Professor Michael Miller, and a woman whose name I have forgotten, who was from Politico. And what she was speaking about was that something could be done if people had a problem voting. And I even asked, is there enough time to do anything? And tonight it looks kind of like no.
Well, Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, so
I'm Italian, and I am very grateful for this insight on American politics. And like you guys make us functional for once. So my question is, like, I'm very curious about the fact that it seems that this kind of problem affect one party more than the other. So I'm really curious about how come the fact that a party could, fighting this could gain more votes. It's not really doing anything. And actually, the numbers that Flora gave us about New York, it seems that,
Yeah.
going in the other direction. So,
Right. So the different parties, and okay.
why don't we let you answer those two?
Okay, so the provisional balloting, right. So the Help America Vote Act, which was passed, I think, in 2003, although don't quote me on that, allowed that if there was ever a problem at the poll, people had the right to cast a provisional ballot, and that ballot would then be looked at after the election. The problem is that each state has a different way they handle provisional ballots. And what we experienced on the ground in North Carolina is a lot of places were really discouraging people from using provisional ballots. Part of that was because they wanted them to be able to cast a real ballot, so they were trying to send them somewhere where they would be able to do that. But the reality that comes from there is a lot of people won't go to the second or third place to cast that ballot. We had one really unfortunate thing happen that wasn't caught on film, which is that there was a woman who came out of Laverne's polling place, and she was really, really upset. The camera crew wasn't there at the time. We were with Steve at the time. But Laverne asked her why she was so upset, and she said that she had to vote by a provisional ballot, but that the person in the polling place told her not to bother because they were going to boot all the provisional ballots anyway. And so what Laverne did, because she was there, was she was like, you turn around, you go back in there, you demand a provisional ballot, you come out, we're going to fill out the affidavit, and I'm going to make sure it goes to court for you. And so that's just an example of that. So the premise is, yes, everybody can vote, and if there's a problem, you can vote a provisional ballot, but in Cumberland County, only a third of those ballots ever got cast, because a lot of times people didn't know or take the time to fill out the paperwork and sign an affidavit and explain why they should have been able to vote. So it's a complex situation. Yeah, so.
And the other question was about why this seems to affect one party more than the other.
You know, it's interesting, because right now, we have, if you want to talk about the voter suppression that goes on, the Democrats are really bad with gerrymandering, I will say that. Like, they are just as bad as the Republicans with gerrymandering, which is a form of voter suppression, because you're really rigging how many votes get counted. But I think that right now, traditionally in America, minorities and the poor tend to vote Democratic right now. So that's why it affects the Republicans to a much greater degree. And almost all of the voter suppression laws that have been passed since 2010, which is when the 26 states have passed these laws, they're almost all being passed by Republican-controlled state houses. And that's the other piece to remember, is that this is not, one of the reasons why this is so difficult to fix is that we're not fixing one set of laws, we're fixing 50 sets of laws, because every state has different election law. So the battle is really in the state houses. It's not on the federal level, which makes it more difficult for there to be a comprehensive sort of national movement. It makes it difficult, a lot of things more difficult. And also the state houses tend to be more radical right now, although I don't know how you get more radical than we are in Washington right now. But
I teach at Fordham, and one of the things that I've been thinking about selfishly is to gain what wisdom you might have about what role you see the undergraduate educator playing in this. I have been toiling at faculty meetings about how I'm in the theology department, we have a duty to, every student has to take a theology class at Fordham University, and so everyone has to see some of us at some point before they leave.
Right.
And so to me, the question is, what role do we have as people forming young people into citizenship, right, at this moment? I hear every day, at least with someone, like, fake news, fake this, fake that, right, which is the undermining of the faith in what democracy is about, right? And of course, just the fact that these people living in, luxury campuses don't vote, right, because it doesn't matter to their spring vacations, right? So the question to me is, what resources do you think, what vision do you think you can give towards undergraduate educators at this crucial moment? I would love any advice at all. So
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you. It's a
Thank
good
you for that question,
Let's take
yeah.
another question also.
Did Laverne and her teammates file any lawsuits, particularly civil lawsuits, non-civil lawsuits? Because her male teammate, who looks like Brian Williams and Tully Blanchard, couldn't control himself once he learned Donnie T was elected.
Why don't all poll watchers have clickers? We were all astounded by this statistic, but I don't think there's broad public knowledge of the problem. If every
No.
poll watcher had a clicker, and that was part of the diligence, then maybe at least awareness could be improved.
I have a comment
Okay,
on
all
that
right, so
one.
why don't
Okay.
we start with the role of faculty in the
That's a
electoral
really
process?
amazing question, and I have to say that I've been going around to college campuses around the country, and it's been both wonderful and really discouraging at times, because the audiences have been consistently less than what the organizers expect. I mean, in this room, there's not a lot of students in this room tonight. We lost our class from Hofstra because they had to leave, but it's a real question. What I will say is that a lot of the conversations I've been having in those places where we have, fewer students, and the students are really frustrated. They're like, our friends don't want to talk about politics. It's too negative. They don't think it has to do with them. They're not engaging on that level. And I think that there's a really fundamental thing we're not talking about as a country, which is that as much as the negative sort of pressure over politics on us is making people more polarized left and right, it's also making people more polarized in terms of being active and checking out. And I think that divide is getting broader and broader. I think that it's the long, hard work of figuring out that we have to step out of the passive role. And that passive role isn't just about politics right now. It's about everything. It's about our culture. And it's a really deep problem, and I wish I had an answer for you. I really do, because we're trying to figure it out with the outreach that we're doing with the film, right? We're trying to figure out, we've been in 16 colleges this fall, and we've been speaking, we've been trying to understand how do we engage people differently, and it's really challenging. I think the key is that how do we revalue the vote? I mean, the role of the citizen has been so diminished. People feel so disempowered. I've been told my whole life, because I grew up in New York, that my vote doesn't matter. I mean, literally, I'm a fairly well-educated, white, rich woman, or privileged person, and I've been told my vote doesn't matter. So you flip that around to people who have less resources, who feel less empowered, and it's really an issue. So I don't know, I'd love to talk to you afterwards, because I'd actually love to brainstorm with you, because I don't know that, I wish I knew.
Okay.
Yeah.
The question about lawsuits.
Okay, so Laverne and Steve and Claire themselves didn't file any lawsuits, but I just want to say there have been a vast number of lawsuits that came out of that election. There were 2 lawsuits about the problems with the Department of Motor Vehicles and the registration there, which is not only North Carolina, but also huge problems in, guess where, Georgia, with the registration that came through the DMV. And part of the problem is the motor voter law puts a lot of responsibility on the DMVs. The DMVs are not doing their job. The finding of the first lawsuit said that they couldn't prove that it was ill intent, but they still said they were responsible for the neglect. So it was sort of a 50-50 ruling. But there's a huge score of lawsuits that are out there. The problem we have now is that since we don't have the protections of the Voting Rights Act, we have to wait for so many things to work themselves through the courts, and that takes a lot of time, and we have elections in the meantime, and you have officials that are elected using these laws which are unconstitutional. I mean, North Carolina hasn't had legal maps in, 7 years or something? It's absurd. So I wish there was more optimism on those fronts.
And the last one was about
The clickers for poll workers. So what's interesting is I can say very proudly, because of the film, in North Carolina, they're training the workers in North Carolina, the inside workers, to have clickers, the people who are organizing a lot of the interior work. So that's a good thing. We'll see what the data comes out as. You know, I don't know what the response is going to be to it, but it is something we need to start to track. There's no question about it.
What are the strategies for getting those people who turned out to vote, and more than half of them were not successful? Because for somebody, those targeted people, they need to be encouraged with some kind of success, because they're going to be faced with the same thing again. And it's against a background where the entire voting population, in terms of Trump and Hillary Clinton, Hillary Clinton got the most votes. So it has to be not only turning out the votes, but it appears to me to be a targeted effort in where it matters. Because
strategy on
one
that of it,
vote per person doesn't seem to count there.
There was another question there.
How did
Yes.
the title, you arrive at the title capturing the flag?
My question has to do with the intersection between criminal justice reform and voting reform as well. So within this film, did you ever encounter this idea of disenfranchisement through criminal justice initiatives, and to what extent you think activism should be involved in that sector as well? Thank you.
Oh, great. We have three questions now. One is, how can we encourage people who weren't able to vote to continue trying?
Yeah, it's a really difficult challenge. I think one of the things that's happened this midterm is that there's been a lot more outreach and publicity for help at the polls themselves. The Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law has a national hotline that operates in every state to help people on the ground with problems. Laverne and Steve and Claire have never done this work. Well, Laverne and Steve have never done this work during the midterm elections. They're going back to North Carolina this week. I talked with the CEO of an organization called We the Action, which is the legal arm of the electionprotection.org volunteers. They have signed up a record 5,000 lawyers to be at the polls to help with exactly this year. So while it's really discouraging, we are finally, I think, we're recognizing the challenges, and it really is about being on the ground for people and making sure those resources are available, which is why it's so important that people volunteer, that people who understand this volunteer to work the polls, that we have a sense that, you know, we reach out with the assistance that's there, because there is assistance for people who are having difficulty. So I would say, like, that's the one good thing.
Okay. The title of the film.
So the title of the film came from obviously the child's game, Capture the Flag, which is a game of territory where the rules keep changing. And that's where the name came from. I actually am not completely wild about the title. We really threw a lot of things up against the wall, and that's the one that stuck the best. But titles are hard, and this is a complicated story. It's a complicated issue. But so that was where the title came from. I wish I had a more satisfying answer for you, but I don't.
And the connection between criminal justice reform and voting reform.
Right. So there are huge connections there. I think that the criminal justice situation in the country is one of the great sort of tragedies of democracy that we have, because not only are we disenfranchising people who have been imprisoned, but we're imprisoning people in an undemocratic way. And so many people that are in jail now have actually never even been to trial because of the economics involved in our justice system. So they are really connected. We encountered a couple of people in North Carolina who were confused about whether or not they had a right to vote as convicted felons. But we didn't experience a lot of that work on the ground. I think it's really important. It's really exciting, the ballot initiative in Florida and the initial response to it. I think if that passes, it can potentially be a model for the rest of the country, and we can start to understand how to do that. The other interesting thing that we encountered that was actually with the military base in North Carolina. There's actually a lot of problems for military people to vote because they're usually voting not in the state. They move around, and they're not in control of when they move around, and the military doesn't actually help them very much with that, interestingly enough. So, so that was the other weird, like, institutional thing that we encountered.
I'm just curious to know whether you screened this in Georgia, because that seems to be the hot spot.
Yeah.
And if you did, what kind of feedback did you get? What kind of attendance did you get?
You mentioned the whole like ill-intentioned versus the impact, and I know that that's a pretty core issue of all these voting rights limitations. And I was wondering if you know what the status is of different state legislatures kind of pushing back on this whole like having to have an ill intent in order to prove that it should be struck down. And then as a follow-up, just in general, you've been talking about this maybe like apathy or feeling of just being overwhelmed with all of these politics. What have you seen are like the most effective ways of addressing people when they say that their vote doesn't matter or that they shouldn't get into politics? Like, what have you seen or experienced is the most efficient or effective way to get people to believe or like have that faith?
I have dual citizenship and vote both in US elections and Estonian elections. So my process of voting is completely different in the two circumstances, and I actually trust my Estonian vote 100% more than I trust my US vote. And I have not voted in that country. I take my ID card, I stick it into my computer, I hit the entry, and I know it's fine. And the one time we had a slight technical glitch, they corrected it immediately. Because you can trace, because of blockchain, you can trace who has seen this and who has done this. And we can put a government up in exile if we have to, should things go south, in under 48 hours. So I've been half paying attention to the voter technology. And again, it's 50 states.
Yeah.
This is insane.
Yeah.
And there are massive technical holes. And yet, if you do it right, it makes it so much easier. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so the first question.
Have we screened
about
in Georgia? We have not screened in Georgia. We have been trying to get a screening in Georgia, but we haven't. We kind of rushed to get the film finished in time for the midterms this year, but our big push with the film is going to be between now and 2020. So we are hoping very much to be in Georgia. We did screen the film in Mississippi, and we screened the film in North Carolina, where the response, we were really nervous. I was really nervous about the North Carolina screening, because there's an element in the film, sort of a carpetbagging element in it with the Northerners coming down south, and I didn't know how people would respond. But they responded really positively, and we've actually screened, oh gosh, about a dozen times in North Carolina. And in Democracy North Carolina, one of the organizations featured actually uses sections of the film for their recruitment for poll workers and for training. So I'm really hoping that we can get it down into Georgia, in a very calculated way, but we haven't had a chance to do that yet. Film distribution's a weird thing, by the way, guys. Like it seems like it should be really easy to just do a screening somewhere. It's actually really complicated. You have to find sponsors, you have to find a space, you have to find someone who'll do the organization and bring everything there. So we've had challenges getting it into certain places. But thank you for that question.
I'm going to answer one of the two questions that the young woman asked. You asked about the status of the various challenges in the state legislatures. There is a wonderful organization that actually was part of making this film called the Brennan Center at NYU, and they have the most comprehensive information on what's happening day to day in every single challenge, in every single lawsuit, in every single state legislature. So if you want to stay on top of what's happening, you should look at their website and read some of their publications. They are really an extraordinary organization. Now, I'll let you answer the question about what to do about apathy, about voter apathy.
So the thing that I always go back to is that House race in Virginia, that the balance of the Virginia State House was potentially going to shift from Republican to Democratic, and it was a tie, and they actually flipped a coin, and it stayed in the Republican control. So if you want to think your vote doesn't matter, your vote matters, and it matters the most in the local elections. And in terms of, the idea that your vote can't affect the national elections, Laverne said something, and I've heard it said before when we did a talk back in Milwaukee last weekend, where, the Electoral College is kind of like the biggest gerrymander we have. And if you sort of think about it that way, we just have to show up in bigger numbers. And that's why not to be apathetic, is that it really is your only chance to have a voice. And I'm really moved by, I was really moved that day, and I'm still really moved, particularly by the woman who Steve helps, whose name is actually Mercedes, even though she drives off in a Mercedes, her name is Mercedes. Her determination to vote, I think, is a great example for all of us. It's like, even if your vote doesn't change something, your vote still counts. I mean, imagine if everybody who lives in a state that they think is too blue or too red to vote, or it doesn't matter, and of course it's going to go either the way I want it to go or not the way I want it to go. If all those people voted, we would have a way better idea of what the popular vote actually is. And if we had a way better idea of what the popular vote is, it might be easier to figure out how we fight to have it reflected more in the government. So that's my statement on that. But I always use the coin toss vote, because it really was. It was one vote, would have changed the entire Virginia state legislature. So.
And the last question was about voting technology.
Yeah. It's really mind-boggling. I mean, I feel like we send our money through the internet, but we don't figure it's safe enough for this. So I don't know what to say, except that it's part of it is that result of having 50 different states with 50 different systems, with 50 different ways of doing things. It should be much easier than it is. There's a couple of people who do really good writing on the whole electronic voting thing, and again, the Brennan Center has some interesting information on that. So I don't really have a good answer for you. I'm sorry. It's incredibly frustrating. But we have states that are models. I mean, I think that, Washington State and Oregon are really great models for how to use technology better than we do. So.
Thank you
guys.
so much.
Thank you for staying to the bitter end. Yay.